Hello everyone. In the last video, we covered why JavaScript functions are known as first-class citizens, and then we covered about higher-order functions and callback functions, and now we understand that functions are not just a block of code, functions are objects. In this video, we will be covering what exactly happens when we try to invoke a function. So let me create the create function again. So here, we just created a function. So when this code is executed, the function object will be created. Now we can invoke this function by using this function name, and then we can add a parenthesis and we can pass the argument. If you see the output, you can see that hello John is printed. Now what exactly happens when we add the parenthesis after this function name and pass this argument? We know that this is an object. Now when we try to invoke this object, internally the JavaScript engine checks whether this object have an internal call method. So I'm representing the call method like this using the double brackets to indicate that this is a completely private method, which means we won't be able to access this method. Only the JavaScript engine access this. So when we try to invoke this function, the JavaScript engine checks whether this function object have this call method. Okay. Now we know that all the function objects have this call, bind, and apply methods. So I'm not talking about this call method. So this call method is a public method. We are able to access it and use it, but this is a completely private method. But these two functions are similar, but this is a completely different one. Okay, so when we try to invoke, the engine checks whether this object have this internal call method. Now, if it finds this call method, then the next step would be conceptually, it will call something like this: create dot call with the arguments. Okay, so conceptually it does something like this internally, and then the next step would be creation of the execution context of this create function, and the execution context will be pushed to the execution stack, and then the body of the function create will be executed, and once the execution is over, the execution context will be removed from the execution stack and the value will be returned. So that's what happens when we try to invoke a function. Okay, now what happens if you try to invoke a normal object? It will fail because normal object does not have the internal call method. For example, so here we have a symbol object having a name field and its value is John. And let's try to invoke this obj. So I'm adding this parenthesis. Now you can see that we have a type error and it's saying that obj is not a function. And from this error message, you can see that it is not saying that obj is not an object. Obj is object. So greet and obj both are object. But this greet internally have this private call method, making this greet object a callable object, while this obj does not have a call method. So when we try to invoke this obj, the engine checks whether this object have this call method. So it doesn't find this call method. So the engine knows that this is a normal object and this is not a function. That's why it is throwing a type error: obj is not a function. Now let's check another example. Here I'm going to use the type of operator to see the type of the objects, some objects in JavaScript, including this function object. So console.log type of. So this is a plain object, and we can repeat this. So here we can give an array, and here we can give a date object. And this is a map object, and here a set object. And here we can simply give greet. So we have more objects that is available in JavaScript, but let's check the case of this. So we know that all of these are fundamentally objects, but they are different objects. Okay, now let's check the output, save this, And you can see that for all of it, except the function one, we get object as the type. But for the function object, it is having a new type called a function. So what is the difference between all of these? So fundamentally, these are all objects, but the function object is a special one. It has this ability to be called, making it an entirely different type. Now let's check the different ways of calling a function. So we already have created this greet function, and let me add this function to an object and an array. I'm just giving the same name as the greet. So here we have an object with the greet is the field name and the value is this greet function. So we can simply write like this, and I'm creating an array here, and the first value is the greet function. Okay, now let's see the different ways of calling this greet function. So first one will be simply calling greet by passing a string. Now we can call the greet function using this object. So it will be obj.greet, and we can pass John. Now we can use this array, and you can see that the first value, so it will be 0, and we can invoke it, John. Okay. Now you probably know the call, bind, and apply method. If you don't know, just leave it. We will be looking call, bind, and apply in depth in the coming videos. So here greet dot call, you can pass null and then John, and here greet dot apply, same, we will be passing null here, and inside an array we will be passing John. Now greet dot bind null John. So this bind returns a new function, and we can invoke that function. So that's why I'm adding an extra parenthesis here. Okay, and the last one, new greet, and here I'm passing John again. Okay, now let's go through this. So this is the normal function invocation, and this is invoking using the object. This is using the array, and here 3 we are using call, bind, apply instance method. So we will be looking at in depth in the coming videos. And finally, we are using the new keyword. We will be looking in depth in the coming video. So here you can see that all of them prints hello John, which means all of them gives the same result. We are calling the greet function, so we called differently. Okay, but even though we are getting the same result here, the internal behavior is different in each of it. Okay, but why we are getting the same result is because one reason is this function is a simple function created using the function keyword, and we are not using any this keyword inside. So when we call them differently, the use of or how internally that this keyword is used will be different. So since this function is not using this keyword, we get the same result across all of this function invocation. So we will be looking more about this keyword, a new, and all these instance methods in depth in the coming videos. So here I'm just um, giving or saying that we can call a function differently. Um, now let me change this greet function to arrow function. So here it's a function created using the function keyword. So if I change this to an arrow function, now greet is an arrow function. I'm saving this, and if you see the output, so here till this line everything worked, but on the 17th line when we use the new keyword to invoke this greet function, we got this error: greet is not a constructor. So from this error message, we understand that greet was a constructor when we created it using the function keyword. Now when we changed it to an arrow function, this is not a constructor. Okay, so from this we understand two things. Arrow functions are not just syntactic sugar of the function keyword functions. The underlying functionality is also different. So we will be looking at more in depth the difference between arrow function and function keyword functions in detail in the coming videos. Now here you have to understand that when we use the arrow function, we will get the error here because arrow functions are not constructor. So what do you mean by constructor is, just like the internal call method, there is another private method called constructor. Construct. Okay, so this is another internal private method. So again, I'm putting this double bracket to indicate that this is a private method, so only engine can access it. Okay, now the second thing that we have to understand is that whenever we call a function like this and when we use the new keyword, the internal behavior is different. These two are fundamentally two different things. So when we use a function name to call a function normally, the JavaScript engine checks, does this object have the call method? But when we use a new keyword to invoke a function, it is not checking whether it have the call method, but it is checking whether this object have the construct method. So that is the difference. So when we create a function using the function keyword, the function keyword functions have both the call method and the construct method. But when it comes to the arrow function does not have this construct method. That's why it is throwing this error. Okay, it only have this call method. That's why all the other cases are working. But when it comes to call, bind, and apply, there's still different between arrow function and function keyword functions, and we will be looking at it in the coming videos. So this is all about uh, what happens when we invoke a function in JavaScript. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching.